You don't want it to be too salty, but you want it to be almost too salty because...
No, you want it to be too salty. You don't want it to be almost too salty. You want it to be way too salty where you taste it and it's like, oh God, you'll put it on your tongue and it will sting because it's so salty. It's like, oh God, it's salty, but that's also delicious. Like that's what a great tare, the experience of tasting a great tare should be. Put it on your tongue, like, oh God, that's pretty good. That's what you're going for with a tare. Hey everybody, Way of Ramen guy here. It's been a while. I hope you guys are all doing well. I'm still technically on hiatus. My kid is in school right now. I'm still doing all the dad stuff, dropping him off, picking him up, helping him with his homework and stuff. So I can't really make ramen yet, but I was kind of inspired recently by my buddy Nigel, who's been doing these Uncle Roger ramen review videos. I actually helped him out with his Jamie Oliver one, so go check that one out. I'll link it up in the description below. But he's dropping some pretty good knowledge for anybody who actually wants to make ramen. So it got me thinking, maybe I could do something similar, not roast people, because honestly, I still suck at making ramen as well. About half the time I make ramen, it comes out terrible. And if you watch this channel, you know that. But yeah, I mean, as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about making ramen and reading a lot about making ramen, talking to other ramen nerds about making ramen, there are things that I see in some of the ramen recipe videos, the more popular ones on YouTube, that I'm like, maybe if somebody knew a little bit better method, they could make something a little bit better. So this is not a roast video. It's just basically like, hey, this person who made this video, here's some things that I think you could do for the next time you make ramen, and it'll probably turn out a lot better. So let's get right into it. So I got YouTube loaded up here and I just searched for Tonkotsu Ramen. Joshua Weissman is probably one of my favorite food YouTubers. So let's check out his recipe and let's just see what we got.
This ain't no gimmick ramen. We're making real deal, traditional-ish Tonkotsu Ramen.
This is something that, it doesn't really bother me that much, but it's kind of funny. So a lot of people know tonkatsu, which is the pork cutlet that you put tonkatsu sauce on. Katsu actually is short for cutlet. It's a loan word that Japanese people have adopted. Tonkotsu is the pork bone. So this kanji right here, I'm gonna put it up on the screen. That's the kanji for bone, and when read together with other kanji, it's read as kotsu. But that doesn't really matter. I'm digressing. Let's just get right back to the recipe.
Tonkatsu is a Japanese ramen that consists mainly of pork bones that are boiled for a very long period of time. This is what results in the mouth-watering, rich and creamy tonkatsu ramen that so many have come to love.
He's correct. Tonkotsu ramen is primarily pork bones that are boiled for a very long time.
3 pounds of pig's trotters go straight into a large stock pot. I wouldn't recommend any other substitutions, especially not chicken or anything like that. The pig's trotters have the perfect ratio of fat and skin that you need for this broth.
Okay, so this is the first thing that I noticed, and it's really common. I think even Kenji Alt Lopez has a recipe for tonkotsu ramen where he just uses pork trotters. Generally, you don't want to do this. And it's because that pork trotters are used for one specific purpose when making ramen, and it's to add gelatin and collagen into your soup. What you're generally trying to do when you're adding trotters to a soup is to bring up the mouthfeel by adding more collagen, more gelatin in there. There isn't actually too much flavor in pork trotters. The flavor comes from bones. So the bone that I personally love the best for tonkotsu is the femur bone, which is called genkotsu in Japanese. Also, another popular one is the backbone, which is called segara. The pork skull is really popular for Hakata style tonkotsu. So if you've ever gone to Kyushu and they had tonkotsu there, more than likely you ate a pig skull ramen. And other ones like shoulder bone, neck bone is really popular too. But basically the flavor comes from the bones. I like the genkotsu, the femur, because it has fat from the marrow too, which helps with the emulsification. What generally makes tonkotsu white and creamy is the fat that's being emulsified into the water as you're boiling it for a long period of time. Pork fat, if you've ever seen lard, is very white. So you're basically shearing that white fat into the water, which gives it that white color. The pork trotters are primarily gelatin. They're not pure white, and they don't really have flavor. So I would generally recommend that if you're gonna make tonkotsu ramen, get a bone mix. Get femurs, neck bones, the skull even, and boil that instead. And then just maybe add, if you want to add a little bit more gelatin to make your soup thicker, you could add a little bit of trotters. So yeah, it's just really common. I've seen a lot of recipes where people use trotters. I would say use a little bit of trotters and mostly bones.
You're gonna fill that with enough water to cover about 2 inches above the bones. Then you're gonna bring that up to a rolling boil for 10 minutes.
I'm gonna skip
Do not
through
skip
here.
this sort of blanching. Skim that off the top using a mesh strainer or a spoon, it doesn't really matter.
Okay, skimming the scum is really good. Pre-boil, this is called a pre-boil or shitayude in Japanese, really common technique. One thing that I like that Joshua did right is that he didn't roast the bones. And I know in Western stock making, oftentimes people say, oh, you gotta roast the bones before you make stock. That gives it more flavor, etc. Japanese people don't do that when they make ramen most of the time. I would say probably 99% of the time. And I'm pretty sure it's just because they didn't have ovens back in the day. They often do this. They'll pre-boil bones, skim the scum. When scum stops coming off, they'll strain it, clean it off, put the bones back into a pot, and then boil that to make their final stock.
Replenish with water as it's boiling. Now to that pot, you're gonna add 1 whole bunch of green onions cut into 3-inch segments.
So this is another really common, I wouldn't say mistake, but it's generally not done this way. So the primary goal for making a ramen soup stock, because you're spending so much time on it, generally you're spending around 6 hours to make a stock for at least a chintan. Tonkotsu, you're going 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, whatever you want to do it. What ramen chefs are trying to do oftentimes is peak extraction of each ingredient that goes in. So Japanese ramen chefs have kind of come up with best practices for extraction times. So for example, you want to make a chicken chintan. Maximum extraction usually starts to happen around 6 hours. Pork starts happening around 8 hours. So these are the general rules of thumb, but if you are an expert, you can break them, of course. And so I know ramen chefs personally that go like 12 hours for a chintan, etc. But for the aromatics, you generally don't want to add them this early in the boiling process. And there are 2 reasons that you don't want to do that. So the first thing is the peak extraction time for a lot of these vegetables is usually an hour or less. You can sometimes add them a little bit earlier, maybe like 2 hours. Like garlic can go a little bit earlier, but generally you want to be adding aromatics near the end of the cooking time for your soup stocks, because what you'll do is when you add them this early, you'll basically hit that peak extraction time like really early, and then you just lose the peak the flavor as it goes through. There is a theory that my buddy Mike talks about with this kokumi idea, which is basically you enhance mouthfeel, and there's some other benefits to overboiling essentially aromatics in vegetables, but aromatics are generally meant for aroma and freshness. The aromatics are not there to be broken down for kokumi. In my opinion, they're made to be aromatic in your soup, and to get an aromatic soup, you need to be hitting that peak extraction time. So generally, if you're a beginner, last hour of the boiling of the soup, you add the aromatics in. But again, if you're a professional, you can play with the rules, and rules are meant to be broken once you're past a certain point. So I wouldn't recommend adding them in this early.
Bring that up to a rapid boil over high heat, and then once it's at a boil, lower the temperature just enough so that it maintains a boil at the lowest possible temperature. Do not reduce it down to a simmer, it must be at a boil. Now once you've done that, add a lid and let it go for 12 hours. That's right, you heard me, 12 hours. Now during that—
This is kind of like a good point. He's doing the right thing. So if you want to do a chintan, which is a clear soup, more like a consomme, you want to keep it just under simmering or a bare simmer, and this helps keep the clarity of the soup. So if you wanted to make a pork chintan, it's called, you'd keep it at a bare simmer. If you want to make a paitan, which is what a tonkotsu soup is, this style of ramen is called paitan ramen. And the kanji, I'll put it up on the screen here, it's basically white hot water, and that's what tonkotsu soup is. You want to get that boiling, and that shears fat into the water, gets that nice white consistency.
At 12 hours, you're going to intermittently stir the pot to keep the pork from resting at the bottom and then sitting at that hot bottom and sort of like burning. You don't want that to happen. They'll burn.
12 hours is a kind of long time for a home cook. I would say you can probably go much less. You can probably get a nice tonkotsu in like 8 hours, for me personally, because the heat, the reason why professional ramen chefs go so long for tonkotsu is they're making these huge batches of soup, like these 100-liter pots. And for the heat to get all the way up through that thing and to get it, you know, rolling and stuff, it takes a long time. If you're a home cook and you're cooking with like a 12-liter pot, it's not going to take that long, honestly. And I've done tonkotsus in like 4 to 5 hours. And the downside for that is the peak flavor extraction is a little bit later, so you got to keep adding and topping it off. But to get a consistency that you want for tonkotsu does not take 12 hours at home.
Now, for the protein portion, if you're feeling extra ambitious and you want to do this super traditionally, you're going to make Japanese chashu, which is soy braised pork belly, just water. For this braise, you're going to need a 2-pound fresh pork belly with the skin on or the skin off. It's up to
The skin on is kind of weird, to be honest. Yeah, most of the time when you make chashu, you're cutting off the skin before you roll it. So, but right, like you said, it's up to you. And there's no, again, let me emphasize, there are no rules in ramen. You can make ramen however you want to make ramen. There's just best practices. So.
And you're just going to roll it up lengthwise all the way up until you get a nice log. Roll it nice and tight.
So this is kind of interesting. So he's rolling it along the grain, and I don't know if that's, I mean, it's probably gonna work, honestly. It doesn't really matter. It's pork belly. It's gonna get really soft when you cook it for a long time, but when you're cutting it, you're gonna be cutting it with the grain, and so maybe the bites aren't gonna be as tender. Generally like to roll it in a way so then when you cut it, you're cutting against the grain. So I would have rolled it the other way, the long way.
Loosely with a lid and place in a 300-degree oven for 3 to 4 hours.
I'm not sure why he put it in the oven when you could have just kept it on the stove for the same time, but maybe just kitchen space saving, because it's the same thing, right? Like you're cooking it, you're simmering it for a long time, whether you're simmering it in the oven or you're simmering it on a stove. It's basically doing exactly the same thing. But this style of chashu, by the way, is called nikomi chashu or nibuta. It's really common. There's a couple of ways to do it. Some people like to do the chashu in just water or in the soup first and then season it later. That's also a really common way. It's basically just what you like to do.
Right, and now we're gonna make the tare. This is the most important piece to the flavor complex of this ramen. We're gonna start off.
Okay, so the tare is something that, I'm glad that he did a tare, because tare is something that I think a lot of people who don't make ramen know about. It's the entire seasoning for the soup. So you have, well, not entire, because the soup itself has flavor, but this is what's gonna give your soup all of the salt that's going to go into the soup. There's no salt added to ramen stock until the very end when the bowl comes together.
By making a very non-traditional dashi. So before anyone comes at me about how this dashi isn't right, I know this is more of a quick dashi. You can certainly do it the old-fashioned way.
I'm guessing what he's saying by the old-fashioned way is steeping the kombu overnight, which is the best way to get the most umami out of kombu. But I've seen it done this way too. It's just like a quicker way. You get less umami out of it when you do it quickly though. It's one of the things about making ramen. Like everything in ramen takes a long time if you want to do it correctly.
If you prefer. To a small saucepot, add 3 2-inch pieces of kombu. This is a relatively easy to find specialty seaweed. You can get it at most grocery stores or you can buy it online. I'll have a link below. To that, you're gonna add 3/4 of a cup of water, and then you're gonna turn the heat on to medium-low and bring it up to a steamy heat. Do not boil this liquid. Just bring it up to a steamy heat, turn off the heat, and let it steep for 10 minutes. Then you're gonna add a 1/2 cup of bonito flakes and let it steep for another 5 minutes.
Steeping for 5 minutes. Okay, so does he turn off the heat? So for bonito, katsubushi, which is bonito flakes, generally you want to kill the heat before you add it because they're really, especially hanakatsu, which is this thinly shaved stuff, they're pretty finicky, and if you oversteep them, you can make your dashi sour. And you generally don't want that. But if you want the sour flavor, then I guess oversteep them. So usually the general best practice, again, no rules, but best practice is you kill the heat, and then you drop in the katsubushi, and then you taste it to make sure that it doesn't get sour, and right when you have the taste that you want, you strain it out.
To this, you're gonna add 3/4 of a cup of soy sauce, a 1/4 cup plus 2 tablespoons of mirin, 1/4 cup of that chashu braising liquid optionally, and a 1/4 cup of the rehydrating liquid that you use for the mushrooms. Then you're gonna give it a stir and lightly season it with salt. Now we want to salt it because you want it to be pretty salty.
I'm not sure if this tare is salty enough. The ingredient choice is whatever, it's fine. The shiitake juice, that's probably adds a little bit more guanilic acid, so that bumps up the umami. It's going to interact with the glutamate in the soy and glutamate in the kombu and the inositol in the katsubushi. So the umami factor is there, but I don't think it has enough salt. When you make a tare, it's supposed to be pretty salty because that's the only thing that's going to be salting your entire bowl of ramen. So generally, ramen chefs will use 20 milliliters to 50 milliliters, somewhere in between there, to season 300 plus milliliters of soup. And if you don't have enough salt, what you're going to need to be doing is you're going to need to keep adding more and more tare to get it salty enough. And then at a certain point, the flavor of the tare itself overpowers the flavor of the soup. And you spend 8 hours, 12 hours making the soup. And then in the end, if all you taste is the tare, you might as well just made tare and made some instant soup using Chinese chicken stock powder or a bouillon cube or something, because all you're going to be tasting is the tare in the end. So I would say it's probably not salty enough. So you need to add enough salt to compensate for the dashi, the mirin, things that don't have salt in it.
You don't want it to be too salty, but you want it to be almost too salty because
No, you want it to be too salty. You don't want it to be almost too salty. You want it to be way too salty where you taste it and it's like, oh God, you shouldn't even, like, you should have a physical reaction to how salty the tare is, where it's like, oh my God, I can't believe I put that in my mouth. But it should also taste good. See, that's the weird thing about tares. Like a good tare, you'll put it on your tongue and it will sting because it's so salty. It's like, oh God, it's salty, but that's also delicious. Like that's what a great tare, the experience of tasting a great tare should be. Put it on your tongue, like, oh God, that's pretty good. That's what you're going for with a tare.
Now to assemble our soups. So first things first, you're gonna need to start by cooking some ramen noodles.
So prepackaged ramen noodles, nothing wrong with that. For your beginners, it's really hard to make noodles at home and it's a pain. I hate making noodles, honestly. It takes so long, so prepackaged ramen noodles are just fine.
Great way to go. Now we're gonna build our bowl. So you're gonna start with a good amount of spoonfuls of your tare. You can add as much or as little as you like. It's purely up to your preference. Just season it.
5 tablespoons of tare is about, what is that? 75 milliliters of tare. That's too much tare. And that's gonna make any soup that you put into it brown because the soy is brown. Soy sauce is brown. There are different types of soy sauce that you could use called usukuchi shoyu, which is a lighter colored soy sauce that is saltier. So a lot of Japanese chefs, if they want to preserve the color of something but still want to get that soy sauce flavor, they'll use usukuchi shoyu rather than standard shoyu, which is called koikuchi shoyu. But yeah, like I was saying, if your tare is not salty enough, you're going to have to keep adding more and more tare to make it taste good, and then eventually your soup just tastes like tare.
However you want it to taste in saltiness and flavor. Now at the 12-hour mark, your broth should be ready. It should be creamy in appearance, and then all you need to do is just strain out the...
So the soup looks okay. It's just that you can see that it's not white. It's like this brownish, yellowish color, and that is from the vegetables breaking down. And that's fine if that's what you wanted. But because you're adding this dark tare as well, this combination of this kind of like off-colored soup plus a dark tare is gonna make your final soup color pretty brown, which is fine if that's what you're going for. There's a style called enoki ramen, which is a pork and chicken python with a shoyu tare, and it gets brown, but it's a nice color, like it looks nice color brown. Sometimes if you get a dirty colored soup and you mix it with shoyu tare, it looks like a dirty brown.
To see if you need to add more tare, add your cooked noodles.
The fact that he can use his hands to put in the noodles makes me think the noodles aren't hot enough. They should be, when you're making ramen, your ideal ramen bowl is put together within a minute. So you have your timing, your noodles to be done, your soup to be done, everything to be done all at the same time. So you're pouring your hot soup, then straining out your hot noodles and putting your hot noodles right in there and then putting all the toppings on and then serving that to your customer instantly. Not as big a deal if you're eating at home, but the experience of eating everything hot together is much better than anything cold because those cold noodles will actually cool down the soup and make it less enjoyable.
Legs cut in half, some enoki mushrooms if you have some. If you don't have any, no big deal. I just like to add them.
I said I wasn't going to comment on toppings, but enoki mushrooms are to ramen what sesame seeds are to sushi. They're just an Asian ingredient that people put there to make something look Asian. Don't put enoki mushrooms on your ramen. That's my only criticism of Joshua Weissman. The rest is just whatever. The noodles look pretty good.
So it's done. Tonkotsu ramen, including the coveted chashu that everybody is about. You know what I mean? I know this recipe is lengthy and involved, but the technique overall and the actual amount of knowledge you need of cooking is rather simplistic. It's pretty straightforward. It just takes time.
I would disagree with that because ramen is hard, man. Like if you watch my channel, you see me mess up all the time, and it's because it's just hard. So maybe for Joshua it's pretty easy to make ramen, but for me it's actually really difficult to make good ramen. If you watch my channel, you'll see me fail like half the time that I try to make it. My chintans are getting pretty good, I will say that. Like I'm pretty happy with how my chintans turn out most of the time these days. But pythons like Tonkotsu Ramen require a lot of thought, and you need to be really careful with your technique and your bone selection. There is a term in Japanese called kodawari, and what that means is an obsession to details. It's considered a good thing in Japanese to be kodawatteru, like if you're very particular, and that's what separates someone who's called a shokunin, which is a craftsman. Think of like Jiro Dreams of Sushi versus someone who's a cook, and that's That's what basically is. And a lot of ramen chefs are very kodawari, and especially the ones that become famous. All of these people are very kodawari, and they're very particular with their choices, and everything that they do when making ramen has a thought process behind it. These aren't just randomly chosen ingredients. Every single one of these ingredients is selected to bring about a final product at the end, and it's very difficult. It's almost impossible for an amateur home cook like myself, which is why this is kind of like a lifelong process of learning how to do this. So good job, Joshua. If anybody's watching Joshua's recipe and wants to try to make his ramen, I would just say take some of the tips that I said in this video and then try to alter it when you make it, and you might be pretty happy with what you get. Let me know if you guys like this style of video. Well, I can do it while my kid is at school and I don't have to cook anything. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. And let me know if you guys want me to break down anybody else's ramen recipe. I'll be happy to do that. Also, go check out my buddy Nigel's Uncle Roger videos. He's killing it, and there's a lot of great information in those videos too if you actually want to learn how to make ramen. So see you guys next time. Peace.